We reject the ideology of globalism, and we embrace the doctrine of patriotism.
Not only will this tax plan pay for itself, but it will pay down debt.
There are moral and legal obligation questions that I think we'll have to wrestle with as a society.
When we as people go wobbly on the truth, we go wobbly on America.
All you have to do is look at the numbers, look at what we've done.
And this is all in the beginning.
From 100.9 FM WXIR, this is Evidence of Design, and I'm your host, Jason Taylor. Evidence of Design is a live talk show about the political economy. We critique income and wealth inequality and support democratic values. Thank you for listening, and welcome. Good morning, everyone. You're listening to Evidence of Design on 100.9 FM WXIR in Rochester. My name is Jason Taylor, your host, and joined by my good friends and co-hosts, Matt Treadwell.
Good morning.
And Mary Lawrence.
Good morning.
This is our last episode of 2019. I'm getting a little emotional, not going to lie. It's also the winter solstice.
Yeah, you're showing it.
So we have our shortest day of the year and first day of winter. Even though I think we've had, above average snowfall in Rochester or something.
Does that mean proportionately this is the longest show? Because, within the shortest day.
Oh.
Just kidding, because it's just daylight.
I like that. Esquire Hour, you all right with us hanging around for... Nah. Yeah, so happy end of the year, folks. We will make this one a good one. For those who are new to this show, we mainly talk about economic inequality, and we figure out why there's so much inequality and why that's important. Because our sort of thesis is that economic inequality is very, very important for how our world operates, and that those in power try to hide the fact that they construct our society to produce so much inequality, and that inequality purposely limits people's ability to live their lives to their fullest and have political power. That's our thesis on this show, and we use that thesis to look at a lot of different things in society. Today, we will be focusing on budgets. This is the 2-year anniversary of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. God, I love how the government names things, like the Patriot Missile Defense System and the Jobs Act. And
get excited.
That stuff is just gives me warm and fuzzies all over. So we'll be talking today about the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. It's I think yesterday was the 2-year anniversary of it. Of course, that is the tax cut. That is the signature legislative achievement of the Trump presidency so far, especially in his first term when Republicans controlled all branches of government, both houses of Congress and the executive branch. So they pass a tax cut, which Republicans, of course, always love to talk about and do, and say tax cuts, tax cuts, tax cuts. We're going to delve deep into the politics behind that. And, has the tax cut helped middle class or poor Americans, specifically middle class folks? Because, Republicans or those in power in general, this is not just to slanderize Republicans, but, politicians in general don't really care about the poor people. In general, they're always talking about the middle class.
That's who they make their most appeals to.
Yeah, and their policies oftentimes hurt poor people in many, 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 many ways. So, has the tax cuts benefited the middle class? We can at least put our scan on. But also, as one of the quotes of the introduction of our show, Steve Mnuchin, the Secretary of Treasury, has the tax cuts paid for themselves
and paid down debt.
Well, look at that.
Surprise, no.
Yeah, short answer, no. The tax cuts haven't benefited the middle class. It's definitely not benefited the poor. It's really only benefited wealthy people, corporations, and it's increased debt. Whoops.
What a surprise.
What a surprise.
Show's over.
Yep, show's over. See you next year, folks. No.
Shortest show for the shortest day.
Yeah. So we're going to be talking about the tax cuts, not just to, look at us, boo-hoo on the tax cuts. I mean, that is significant, right? We deserve to boo-hoo on the tax cuts because that is very important. And how the economy operates is through boring and arcane rules of the road, like tax policy. Our society is directly constructed from things like tax policy, and that stuff matters because that allows people to live their lives in certain ways. And if you have a lot of money, you benefit a lot from rules like that. If you don't have a lot of money, in part, you don't have a lot of money because of rules like that. So that is very important to talk about. We're also going to be talking about budgeting in general. What does it mean to balance a budget? Should we balance budgets? Is that our highest priority and highest need? A lot of discussion going on about that right now, and we'll get into it this hour. So we've gone on long enough. Let's jump into things, but first I want to quickly remind you that you can participate. 585-219-8889, 585-219-8889. We are live for you on Saturday, the 21st of December, 2019. Give us a call. You can also email us, radioeod@gmail.com, and Facebook and Twitter at radioeod as well. Matt, ready to take it away?
We're ready.
Let's do it.
And that was Total Football by Parquet Courts.
And this is Evidence of Design on 100.9 FM WXIR. So folks, happy 2-year anniversary of the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. That was the signature legislative accomplishment of the Trump administration, especially when the Republican Party controlled all branches of government in both houses of Congress and the executive branch. Let's remind folks the major provisions in that Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. It did a number of things. We're going to highlight a few of them. So the tax cut, as you might expect, cut taxes. But did it do it for everyone at the same rate? No. When you're talking about taxes, you have basically two different things. You have the tax rate. That is the percentage that your dollars will be taxed. So if there's a tax rate of 10%, 10% of whatever that your income is will be taxed. But then you have to complicate things a little bit and add on the tax brackets, and that is sort of the range of dollars that will be taxed at various amounts. So if you pull up like the federal government's tax bracket, you'll see that different incomes fall into different tax rates, and only the incomes that fall into a specific tax bracket will be taxed at their respective tax rate. So if the top marginal tax rate, that is the top tax rate, if that's going to be like 39.6%, which is what it was before the tax cut, it doesn't mean that 39.6% of all of your income is going to be taxed. What it means is that only the income that falls within that tax bracket that corresponds with a 39.6% tax rate, that's what will be taxed. All of your other incomes will be taxed at the tax rates that below that fall into the tax brackets. Guess what? If you don't make a lot of money, you don't have to worry about how many tax brackets you fall into, because you might only fall into the first one or the second one or so on and so forth. So, we could have a very long discussion on tax policy and tax rules, but the point is, in me generalizing all of this, is to say that this Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017, it lowered the top tax rate from 39.6%, which is where it was under the Obama administration, to 37%. So it slightly lowered the top marginal tax rate, meaning the wealthiest Americans will pay less in taxes. More importantly, I would argue, though, is that it changed the tax brackets. So it made it more lenient. It made it less punitive. It lowered the amount of money wealthy people will pay by lowering the tax brackets, meaning that the more money you make, you might fall into a lower tax bracket than before. So by both lowering the tax rate and by changing the tax brackets, the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act basically reduced the tax burden on the wealthiest people. Yes, it did lower the tax brackets for a few folks in the middle, but not by much. And again, tax policy is so complicated that it really depends on other provisions as well. So in general, the tax cuts overwhelmingly went to wealthy folks. And according to an NPR article that came out yesterday, 60% of all of the tax cuts went to the top 20% of income earners in the United States. So this tax policy was overwhelmingly supportive of the wealthiest people in society. That's the most important thing.
I seem to remember Trump being overheard saying as much to some wealthy investors back when this was first being considered. I don't have like the actual article or thing producing that, but the only point I'd like to make is that I believe that this is intended.
Oh, it's 100% intended. Yeah, I mean, we're talking about tax policy, right? Like, this is policy that a lot of people sit around a table and do math and figure out how it works. None of this is an accident. You have teams of lawyers and lobbyists and politicians, people getting together to write policies like this. None of this is an accident, Matt. I would agree with you there. And yeah, absolutely. Like, I think you would argue that the Republican Party in particular, but also the Democratic Party, is very incentivized to give tax breaks to wealthy people, because right now our government and our society, I would argue, is run by wealthy people. And so, you saw that last night if you watch the Democratic debates. Was that last night? No, it was 2 nights ago.
2 nights ago.
Two nights ago. Yeah. So 2 nights ago, if you watch the Democratic debates, you saw that right now in the Democratic Party, there's debate going on between like the Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren camp against sort of like the, Pete Buttigieg or the Joe Biden camp, and saying that, like, look, man, you're all in cahoots with billionaires, and they counter and quibble back and forth. So that is a debate going on in the Democratic Party. And the Republican Party, that's not even a debate, because that's just how the game works, So at least we have that debate going on in that Democratic Party. But by and large, I would argue, yeah, our society is kind of run by the wealthy people. So again, we're talking about this 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. We're at the 2-year anniversary of it. How much has it benefited us as a society? Well, first of all, the vast majority of tax cuts went to wealthy people. Other important provisions in the bill is that the corporate tax rate was reduced from a graduated tax rate. That means it's kind of like our income taxes, where the more money you make, the more you're taxed. That was the same thing with the corporate tax rate. So it was reduced from a top corporate tax rate of 35% to a flat corporate tax rate of 21%. And that doesn't even sunset. So when I say sunset, that's something in when you're drafting legislation, a sunset means that the bill is set to expire.
Right.
That's famously what happened with the
assault weapons ban.
Yeah, thank you. In the 90s. That had a sunset provision because the NRA and conservatives wanted the bill to expire after a set period of time because, of course, they opposed it. And if you have a sunset provision in a bill, that makes it much more likely that it's going to fall apart and not be reauthorized once that happens, because you have to get the whole political will again to make that happen. So, interestingly, this corporate tax rate is not sunset in the bill. It is basically the future of America until legislators and the executive branch want to change it again, that we're going to have a flat corporate tax rate of 21%. And again, Matt, you've brought up a lot before on the show that a lot of corporations didn't even pay that rate anyways to begin with. The Amazons, the Walmarts, and a lot of folks in between paid a much less in taxes than the top tax rate would suggest.
Sometimes they don't even pay anything, and they get actual tax. I don't remember
credits,
what the term.
Subsidies.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Totally.
That seems fair.
Yep. So not only are most of the income tax rates, not only are most of the benefits from the income tax reductions going to wealthy, but the corporate tax rates were reduced, which again benefits the wealthy. Also the estate tax. So this is the tax that for some reason in America people seem to defend, even though it only benefits like 1 in 1,000 people. The estate tax is basically a tax on inheritance for large sums of assets and property. So if you're someone who's very wealthy, tens of millions of dollars, and you pass away, will your estate be taxed and not all of it go to your children or whomever you put in your will?
Yeah, we're talking like Harlan Thrombey.
Harlan Thrombey from Knives Out, exactly. 2 episodes ago, you got to check that out. So the corporate tax rate stays. I'm sorry, not the corporate. The estate tax rate stays the same in this Tax Cut and Jobs Act at 40%, but the exemption on it was doubled. That means that it doesn't really apply to you unless you have sort of twice the amount of income as it was originally. So the tax doesn't apply to. It used to apply to folks with an estate worth It was $5 million for individuals and $10 million for married couples, and now they essentially doubled the exemption so that the 40% estate tax doesn't apply to you unless you make more than like $11,000, unless your estate is worth more than $11,000.
$11 million.
$11 million. Thank you very much. I'm all over the place. $11 million for a single head of household, and then $22 million for married couples. That's only 0.1% of the American population. That's 1 in 1,000 people would pay that tax. For some reason in America, a lot of like normal folks who will never have even $1 million in their life, not to their fault, but because of the structure of society, they're like against the estate tax because there's something in American culture that's like, if you earned this wealth, you deserve it, and the government shouldn't take it.
But also you're dead, so.
Yeah, not only are you dead, but like, the argument against that would be that, money creates money, and your children didn't necessarily do anything to deserve that wealth, and doesn't mean take it all away from them and have them start from zero, but it's like, do they need to be born with $22 million in assets.
Also, doesn't it only apply after that $11 million?
I believe so, yeah.
So you're still getting $11 million.
Yep. Exactly, Matt. Yeah, so it's like even though you're being taxed, you're still going to have tens of millions of dollars, in theory. So, yeah. So again, this 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act lowered the estate tax effectively for people, making it so the wealthiest 1% of Americans would no longer have to pay that as much in the estate tax. Also, it increased the charitable deductions, meaning that wealthy people who give a lot of money to charity and philanthropy, they can deduct more of that. It went from 50% to 60% of all that they donate from their taxable income and wealth. That's very... Matt, go for it.
Have you seen that? This was a while ago, but there was a few months ago, there was this Verizon ad where they were talking about how they made a bunch of tablet donations to schools across the country. And the only thing I could think of when I was watching it was if you paid taxes, we probably could fund education better. I think the kids would probably give the tablets back.
Yeah.
They could keep their teachers.
Yep. Yes, indeed. This also is something that warrants scrutiny, this whole idea of charity, because a lot of people, I think, would defend charitable contributions. Look, if you have a lot of money, there's a lot of people with money doing really good things with the money, and giving to the philanthropy is a good thing. Well, it's not necessarily a good thing. One, Matt, you're showing that, instead of spending money tangentially to the problem, you want to improve education, let's buy a bunch of iPads for education. Why don't you just spend more on education so you can have more teachers or higher quality services and so on and so forth? So there's that argument. The other argument is that nowadays in America, because of a lot of other changes in society that have allowed lobbyists and corporate power to influence politics, because, Citizens United and corporations are people and dollars are the First Amendment, freedom of speech, all that sort of stuff, a lot of wealthy donations go to people's own private philanthropies and political lobbying organizations. So what is effectively happening is that very wealthy people are able to donate their money to organizations that do political advocacy for a minority of people, mainly those who are wealthy enough to donate the money to begin with. So you're ending up with a society that is governed by a minority of people who have, interests and power to preserve their own interests and power. And so, again, charitable deductions and taxes sounds like a good thing on the face, and it could be, but also we have to be more skeptical and scrutinize it more because it allows wealthy people to make their money go farther to preserve their own interests. And also, this doesn't really apply to what we're talking about, but the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act also effectively repealed the individual mandate of the Affordable Care Act, which means that the Affordable Care Act was basically gutted. And we know also that Republicans tried to repeal that plan without replacing it, even though they campaigned on repeal and replace for essentially a decade. And then they ended up, even though they had control of both the executive and legislative branch of government, to just repeal it with no replacement. And, John McCain, before he passed away, famously cast the no vote on that on the Senate floor. So we just went through kind of an overview of some of the provisions in the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that we're now at the 2-year anniversary of. It lowered the top marginal tax rates and made the tax brackets more favorable to the wealthy. It reduced corporate tax rates, and they don't have a sunset provision on those reductions. It made the estate tax less onerous for the most wealthy in society, and it increased the deductions on charitable contributions, meaning that wealthy people can further their own interests by having more donations and write that off from their taxes. So this tax cut was writ large the best Christmas gift possible for wealthy Americans, And it's unfortunate that we've seen that in American policy for a long time. Matt, is that something that you would agree with?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're at our 2-year anniversary of it, and why we're talking about this today on 100.9 FM WXIR in Rochester is because we're talking about budgets today. And how much do budgets matter, and what are the politics behind balancing budgets? We hear a lot in the news, locally and nationally, about the need to balance a budget, and that is the most important thing we can do. I would argue there's a lot more to that conversation that we don't talk about all that much. For instance, we have Steve Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, who, when this tax cut was passed, he said, not only will this tax plan pay for itself, it will pay down debt. Of course, we've seen the U.S. government debt increase by a lot of money. We're currently at a national debt of like $22 trillion, and the annual budget deficit of the United States is like
$900 billion.
$984 billion, which is what you have written down here.
Yeah, so we're almost at $1 trillion operating annual budget deficit, which is within our operating budget. So our national and federal government is by nowhere near balancing its budget. And historically, at least, Republicans have always been the one to campaign on what they would call fiscal responsibility. That is the idea that we have to balance budgets because, gosh darn it, American families work hard to do it with their kitchen table conversations, and they pull out their wallet and their bills and they figure out how to make ends meet because they work hard, gosh darn it, and that sort of conversation.
Is that Ted Cruz?
I don't care who it is, it's just the idea. But yeah, Ted Cruz would be someone up there. But that's kind of the argument,
Seems like a gosh darn it kind of guy.
Sounds like a queso kind of guy. But that's sort of the argument. And unfortunately, I think Republicans have used that fiscal responsibility idea as a cudgel, as a weapon against Democratic administrations. They really went after Obama for ramping up government spending, but mind you, that was after the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. And if you know anything about Keynesian economics or government, or the need for government to support economies and the status quo, one could argue Obama had to spend a lot of money to right-size the economy. One could also argue that he should have done nothing and let the banking institution collapse. That caused the crisis to begin with. But, that's sort of a different conversation. The point I'm trying to make is that Republicans have abandoned that idea of balancing a budget. Because aren't we supposed to be right now living in like the strongest economy in 70 years with the lowest unemployment, strong GDP growth, even though it's not?
Unemployment is very low, but inequality is still on the rise.
Well, just because someone has a job doesn't mean that they can actually support themselves
or a family.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've talked about that on the show before, that if you pull up any news organization, you'll see that the economy is strong. The economy is roaring. Americans have a strong perception of the economy. And, Trump repeatedly campaigns on the fact that the economy is doing great. But as you both just mentioned, and we've mentioned on the show, that I think we believe the economy is not strong at all right now, and that there are serious problems with it.
Or if it's strong, it's just strong for certain people.
Precisely. So just because unemployment is low does not mean that the economy is strong. There's a lot more to that. And so right now, let's go with that argument, though. Let's say the economy is going really strong right now. Why are we running $1 trillion annual budget deficit? Because normally when the economy is strong, the government is able to recuperate its losses and pay down its debt. Well, the reason for that is because we finally become more transparent. We, as in people in power, particularly those who are wealthy, have finally become more transparent to say that they've never cared about the deficit to begin with. And that it's always easier for wealthier people or those who are in power to create debt and then pass off the problems with that debt to future generations or those who are poor or don't have power. And so I'm not here to argue whether or not debt on the government level is good or bad. There's great debates going on right now of whether a $22 trillion national debt matters or not. Will China control us because they own so much of the U.S. debt and things like that. Like that stuff is created by an economy that in part doesn't even exist in the first place. We create the economy every day by waking up and believing in it. And so, we're not here to sort of engage in that debate. The point is that this idea that our first responsibility to pay down debt and balance budgets doesn't seem to hold weight when we take into consideration something like the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which has decreased revenue for the government and increased in-pocket savings for the wealthiest Americans. Again, more than 60% of all the savings on the tax cuts went to the top 20% of income earners and wealth holders. And so I argue here in this episode today is that we, for too long in America, have had a tendency to fix our deficits by cutting spending as opposed to increasing revenue. Something the Republicans have done very well over the past several decades is to convince us that austerity, or the idea that we need to decrease spending, is the way to fix our economic problems. We're spending too much.
It doesn't seem like they're actually very good at doing that, though, especially when we look at, the recent military budget, for example, which is, I think, over 700 million. It's the highest military budget in, I think, American history. And so it's not even...
Billion,
It's not even accurate, to say that we're going to cut spending, but then they don't cut spending, but in fact increase it.
That's my point I'm making, precisely, Yeah,
I mean, there seems to be this this cultural idea that that because governments operate on like a bureaucratic sense, that they are ineffective or bloated or otherwise just wasting a lot of what is put into them. But the reason, I think there's an argument to be made that why it might feel that way is because they continue to be, revenue continues to be cut, and it's just getting harder and harder for people to find ways to spend money on things like public education and infrastructure, and when so much of the money that is still being taken in is just devoted to the military or to whatever else.
And I think it's maybe helpful to point out that one of those, or I guess the main source of revenue for the government is through taxes. So when we're cutting taxes, we're cutting the revenue and the amount of spending that our government can do in order to support the system that we have.
Precisely. And so this would be the time when our economy is so-called strong for the government to have more revenue to pay down its debt. Instead, the government has less revenue and increasing debt in a time when the economy is strong. So when, then, will the government get the ability to pay down its debt? When the next time the economy crashes? I doubt it. So when are we going to have a strong enough economy? What alchemical performance must happen such that we can pay down our debt? Again, I'm not even interested in engaging that discussion that much. I'm just here to point out the fallacy or the illogicalness of the argument that, paying down debts matters to people who are in power when, you're right, Mary, we have a $700 billion military budget. But even that, great. You can have as much money. Let's have a compromise stance here. You can have as much money as you want on your military budget. But we need more revenue then to pay for other things that we need as a society, like, stuff like healthcare and education and housing and transportation.
They spend all that money on the military, they can't even get proper healthcare for veterans.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. So again, more fallacies where, if you really cared about veterans, you would actually fund the VA and other forms of social safety nets and mental health, for people who fight wars that you as someone in power and who's wealthy create. But of course, for the most part, they don't care about that. They as in those who are in power and wealthy at large. You can't generalize everyone, but at large. And so I think we will take a short break here on 100.9 FM WXIR. You're listening to Evidence of Design. We're talking about budgets today. Do we need to balance budget? What are some of the politics behind balancing budget and some of the fallacies in our politics when it comes to saying we need to balance a budget in this case, but not in that case? We're talking about all of that today. This is our last new episode of the year, of course, of 2019, and we would love to hear from you in our second half of the show. You can give us a call at 585-219-8889. Again, that's 585-219-8889. Again, in continuing our conversation about the 2-year anniversary of the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and how that by and large benefited the wealthy, we're going to perhaps pivot to talking about education and the need or not to balance budgets in education. So we'll be right back on 100.9 FM WXIR. This is Evidence of Design.
Guiding Light by Television.
And this is Evidence of Design on 100.9 FM WXIR in Rochester. We are talking about budgets today. Oh boy, everyone wanted to talk about that in the last new episode of the year of the winter solstice, shortest day, but longest episode. Thank you for that, Mary.
Only proportionately. Proportionate to the amount of light we have today.
We're talking about proportions today in terms of taxes and GDPs and things like that. And I want to remind folks that you're able to participate. 585-219-8889. Again, 585-219-8889. We're live for you on Saturday, December 21st. Let's continue our conversation. We were talking about the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. It's our 2-year anniversary of that historic piece of legislation that has not paid for itself, not paid down debt, and not benefited most Americans.
Mark your calendars.
Darn it. So I want to sort of have us talk about the role of government in all of this. And I want to frame this perhaps by using a useful metaphor. And that is that when we're talking about tax cuts, again, the point of our show here on Evidence of Design is to critique and investigate income and wealth inequality, and I think a lot of this doesn't happen in mainstream media for a number of reasons. One is that it's boring and complicated and not sexy, and that our culture kind of disproves talking about anything related with class. If you bring up money or class standing, ability to make your ends meet beyond through some far-fetched notion of hard work and individual responsibility, it's taboo to talk about it.
It's a myth of the meritocracy.
Exactly.
On a related note, what are bootstraps actually?
Yeah. Oh boy. I look this. Oh man. Is it going to come back to me?
I just I was just thinking, obviously with the pull yourself up by your bootstraps, but like, what are bootstraps?
Okay. I think this is it. So
is it like the thing on the back?
I always picture bootstraps as suspenders, but I know they're not. Like suspenders for your boots, which would be pretty sweet. I would rock those. So I think if this is true, that the whole pull yourself up by your bootstraps
is it because there aren't any bootstraps?
Yeah, so it's actually funny that we use that to say that you should pull yourself up by your bootstraps, but I think the saying was originally created to say that, like, you can't pull yourself up by your bootstraps. So the idea was that if there's, like, a fence that you're trying to get over, and someone's trying to get over the fence by pulling up on their boots, like, to jump over the fence by physically pulling up your feet to get over the fence, you can't do that. Like, you're a fool for trying to pull up your bootstraps to jump over the fence.
Wow.
And I think that's where the saying came from, if I'm correct. And so it's just funny that we use that now as like a pro thing. Like, you should pull yourself up by your bootstrap, when in fact, like,
it originated as a
to prove that you can't do that.
Different meaning.
Exactly. Yeah. Kind of like how awful Shakespearean was, like, you're full of awe, and now awful means like full of bad things as opposed to full of good things. It's funny how language changes.
Yes, I actually, I've got the Wikipedia page in front of me, and it just says the term appears to have originated in the early 19th century United States, particularly in the phrase, pull oneself over a fence by one's bootstraps. And, which was, as you said, to mean an absurdly impossible action.
Yeah. So keep
nice
that
way there.
Keep that in mind.
We're not killing for time.
No, it actually just came to mind when I was just thinking of the bootstraps, and I'm like, I'm wearing my hiking boots that I've used for working in various times in my life, and I'm like, I don't know what the straps are. I don't have any straps. I guess I've always imagined it as like pulling yourself up by your laces. And I was like, that doesn't work. That doesn't make sense.
Well, isn't that so powerful and beautiful there? Like, that's the whole point of the saying and the realization is that you can't just pull yourself up by your bootstraps in life, because society is made so that you can't do that. The people who
society didn't make bootstraps.
So here's the point of how society prevents you from having bootstraps or pulling yourself up by them.
My mind is blown actually right now.
Yeah.
So everyone has that fence in front of them.
Everyone has that fence. Exactly. And so I like to say, when we're talking about something like tax cuts, like picture tax cuts as the rules of Monopoly. If we're all sitting here playing Monopoly, when we say play Monopoly, we all know exactly what I'm talking about if you've played it before, because it's all the same rules. If you play a board game with different rules than what the board game is inherently defined by, you're no longer playing that game, right? Monopoly means the rules that we all share for that game. Okay. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
So if you change the rules, you're not playing Monopoly anymore. You're just playing an aberration of Monopoly. And the whole definition of a game is that it's the same set of rules. So when we change the tax plan, we are essentially changing what it means to play Monopoly, and so some people, this is an easy example, but some people collect $400 when they pass go as opposed to $200 or something like that, but you're changing the rules. And so this is why it's very important to actually look up what's like in things like tax plans and look at marginal tax rates, because it sounds so superfluous. Why would you waste our time on that? That's too complicated. That doesn't affect me, but it directly affects you because, Mary, to get to that bootstrapping point, it defines the height of the fence and defines your ability to step over it, to jump over it, to climb over it, or if it just falls on you, and you're unable to get over that.
Or whether even you have boots on in the first place.
Could be wearing sandals.
Or nothing.
Matt's just looking at us like we're...
I'm still trying to put the whole Monopoly thing together.
Yeah.
If you were to play Monopoly, if you want to extend the Monopoly metaphor, if you wanted to extend it to how everyday American life functions, I think you would have to have
a much larger
1,000 players, and 999 of them would start with $5, and one person would start with a $500 bill.
Yeah.
That's what living in America is like.
And that's what the estate tax is all about, right? Like when we think of playing Monopoly, we all start at zero. We start at the start. But in real life, you don't start at zero. I mean, some people start at negative. Some people do start at zero. But
some people start with a small loan of $200 million.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, just $1 million, Matt. Only a $1 million loan.
Oh.
I think.
Who knows?
Oh, Trump.
Hashtag self-made.
Yeah. So I think that's useful to framing this conversation. But Mary, why I brought that up is because we were going to talk about sort of the role of government, right? And did you have sort of an anecdote or some way to phrase that? Because I can keep going, but I've talked a lot.
No, just like when we were having, or when you were mostly talking in the first part of the episode with a lot of really, I think, important information that I don't even think about most of the time. I was just thinking about this conversation I had with my mom earlier this year, talking about what the role of government is. Because, we've talked a lot about on this show how we feel that Medicare for all is a good idea, that healthcare should be a basic human right. And it's hard to understand where people don't agree with that, how can you not agree that everyone in the country being healthy is good for the nation, because it means that everyone else is healthy. And so an interesting way to kind of get at that in conversation is just, I decided to ask my mom, what, in your opinion, is the role of government? What do you think that government should provide? Because, for me, I'm I think that in order to support a good, a stable society, government should help to fund healthcare, education, defense, but, basic things that will keep our nation healthy, mentally, physically, and, and to bring us forward through education, because that is, I believe, the best way to bring us forward. And, that's not stuff that's written in the Constitution. I think in the Constitution, the federal government contributes to defense. And there's one other thing that I can't actually remember, which is pretty bad because there's only two. But all those other things are delegated to states, so they're not something that the federal government should, quote unquote, according to the Constitution, needs to provide for. And obviously, the federal government or the Constitution was written 300 years ago, 250 years ago. And I think that those are things that should change or that we should want as a society. But on my mom's end, that wasn't something that she saw. And she, was like, oh, well, these aren't things that are written in the Constitution, so we don't necessarily need to expect the federal government to provide things like healthcare and education for us. When we were talking about healthcare, she also brought up an interesting concern, which was that having a state-run healthcare system, meaning that there would only be one system, would actually drive the prices up. And that's not something that I would think of, in my view, that if we have government-run healthcare and not capitalist competition that is for profit, that we wouldn't be paying as much for healthcare because they wouldn't, the healthcare system would not be in it for a profit. But in her view, she was worried about those prices actually going up because of a quote-unquote government monopoly on healthcare.
Yeah, I mean, I completely disagree with that, but it's good to have a different opinion such that you can leverage your opinions against it, I suppose.
Well, it was interesting, too. I mean, we both went into it kind of open, and she didn't seem like she was married to those views. Yeah. It's just what she had learned growing up and what she'd kind of always thought, and it was really interesting to have that conversation and see how different our views are, because I think we have so many assumptions about what people think or what is right, but without actually having the conversation, we can't look at why we differ. Yep.
So I want to do a small tangent here, but Mary, that's very important, and this is the biggest problem with this show, Evidence of Design, is that we do not have people calling in, and we don't have people emailing us, and I want to be transparent about this. The reason why we have a live radio show in a local grassroots radio station is that we want community feedback and input. And let's be honest, we don't get a lot of calls to the show. 585-219-8889. And
that's a non-subtle hint, by the way.
Well, I'm not joking because, Mary, because otherwise we have talking heads behind a microphone and we're just spouting out our view into the void. And I have been adamant. People have asked me a million times, if this thing called Evidence of Design is worth doing, and there's a lot of media out there, I don't want to pat myself on the back and think that what I have to say is the most important thing ever, but I sort of believe in the values that this show has. I've been asked, why don't you just do a podcast? Because it's a lot easier to make better content by spending more time to, craft your arguments and make things sound better. I purposely want to do live radio, which is messier, and we don't have all the facts, and we stumble in things, because we want the input from people to share different points of view, like you bringing up that conversation with your mom. And we currently don't have that on the show, and that is the biggest problem that we've had, in my opinion, with this show. And so, I would encourage folks, if you're listening, whether you're driving right now, I know you can't call on your phone, whether at least, if you have a handheld device, you can. But whether you're driving and you're tuned in Rochester to 100.9 FM WXIR, if you're listening on the TuneIn app anywhere in the world, if you are on the website www.1009wxir.com, and you hit the play button, however you're listening, we are telling you now 585-219-8889 is your chance to share your opinion and voice. Because otherwise, you're right, Mary, we don't really get anywhere as a society without going that back and forth.
Yeah, and in that case, her concern brought up something that I hadn't thought about, and I think it is a legitimate concern. And that is a way, those are things that we need to think of as a society too, in order to make sure that we can work towards something that does work for everyone, and that, at least most people can agree on. Because, people have worries. I think a lot of decisions are based in fear of what the alternative could be. I think in listening to each other and hearing those concerns, we can work to make sure that those things don't happen, or, figure out ways to make the alternative a little softer.
Hopes and fears.
Hopes and fears. Yeah, I think that conservatism, not as a political ideology, but yes too, but also as just the idea that things should remain the status quo, is a normal human thing, right? We are averse to taking risks because as a species,
it's scary.
We've evolved, to not want to take risks and potentially endanger ourselves. And so I want to bring in a quote. Actually, we should divert, because we do have a phone call coming into Evidence of Design on 100.9 FM WXIR. Let's give it a shot. Hello, are you on the air? Hello.
Hi. How's it going?
Coming in hot. Hey, Aaron from Queens. Let's turn down your volume a little bit. And
hey.
What's going on?
Yeah, that's right. Aaron from Queens here. You just sounded so sad, Jason. So I just wanted I'll always call in for you, buddy, man. I'm here, man. You ever want to
know
talk?
You're here.
What do you? Thanks.
I'll write you a letter. I'll send you a greeting card, a box of chocolates, man. Whatever you need.
I would like a box of chocolates.
Radio's a lonely business, man.
Yeah,
it's
it's true. It's just you and a mic talking into the void, man.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But now I feel connected to a citizen. Good day, citizen.
Yeah, I'm not a citizen of Rochester, but I'm a citizen of something.
Hence your title, Aaron from Queens.
Aaron from Queens, that's right.
Aaron from Queens, can I ask you, unless you had something you were calling in about, not just to keep me company, which really that gives me the fuzzies, but do you sort of have an insight on what we were talking about earlier in the show on budgets and the politics behind balancing budgets and the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act? Do you have anything to say on that large spaghetti-esque topic?
Did you just say spaghetti?
No.
Okay.
Great.
Yeah, but I did want to ask about something else. Have you guys been following the election in Britain at all? I was in Atlanta last week, so I missed that show. I don't know if you talked about the election over in England.
We
haven't talked about
not.
it.
No, we've been a little bit more focused on.
I heard it was the greatest
local.
loss for Labour in like 70 years or something, and that Jeremy Corbyn is talking about resigning from leading the party.
Yeah, so I know. I know we don't. Wait, you guys aren't allowed on radio to endorse parties, right? Can you endorse specific candidates?
No,
I don't think so.
I don't think so.
All right, can I call her?
I don't know, man. What?
You can tell us who you support.
All right,
yeah.
Well, you know I love my boy Bernard. What do you think about how Corbyn's loss, how Labour's loss in that election reflects upon Bernard's chances if he gets a nomination, or just Democrats in general in the U.S., if it has any bearing at all? Just wanted to get your opinion on that.
Yeah, I was actually going to bring up, I'm glad that you called in about this, actually. I was going to bring up the elections in the UK when Mary was talking about people being scared of an alternative future, and that's why I was bringing up conservatism with, people's aversion to risk-taking. I think that I would argue that what we saw with the defeat of Labour, even though they weren't in power to begin with, in the UK, to be an example of people's unwillingness or inability to imagine an alternative future. It's very, very hard to imagine universal health care. In fact, there's a great quote, I forgot who it's attributed to, but I used to know that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. And I think, bam, right there, you have sort of our issue as a society, is that it's much easier to imagine us all literally dying, humanity, by nuclear holocaust or climate change or war or disease than it is to imagine universal health care or social means of production,
Well, I mean, everyone dies eventually.
That was a big element in the last debate, is the only time sparks really flew is when Bernard and Joe were talking about Medicare for All, and Bernie was, talking about how great it would be in his plan, and increased taxes, but it's offset by lower costs of healthcare overall. And Joe Biden is there basically just saying, nope, can't be done. 30 trillion, impossible. Yep. Don't even think about it. And it's just sort of like, when you sort of see it's like a large scale national level of somebody who's just really depressed and down in the dumps and doesn't think they can be good themselves, and is just feeling really crappy. And if somebody wakes up every day and thinks they're a piece of crap and tells themselves, I'm worthless, I'm not going to do anything, so I shouldn't even try, that's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yep.
If you're not going to be able to do anything yourself, or if you don't think you can do anything, then you don't. Then it becomes true. And that's the same exact thing for a nation as a whole. If we don't think there can be anything better, if we don't think there can actually be any change, if nothing's worth pursuing, then nothing ever will change.
Yeah.
You have to have that pre-existing condition of believing that it's possible before anything's possible.
Let me jump right in on that too, Aaron. Yeah, that goes to, we have another guest in the studio who hasn't been on the mic yet, but he was bringing up Republican cynicism, and that the Republican Party is basically marketing cynicism and the belief that we can't get anything done. But also, it goes to my point. Thank you for bringing that up.
Is the guest named Jeff?
It is, yeah.
Jeffrey.
So you're bringing up the point here, Omniscient. You're bringing up the point between Joe Biden and Bernie, and Biden always says, we can't get it done. Too much money. Where are you going to get this money? We just spent the first half an hour of the show talking about that it seems like debt doesn't really matter in many places, right? We have a $22 trillion national debt, and then the federal government decreases the tax rates. And so, like, we can't pay for things now. Why should we imagine that we can pay for anything in the future? So, like, why don't we just go ahead and create?
We have enough time to discuss this in the remaining part of the show. But modern monetary theory, I'll just say that. Look it up. It's an interesting. It's an interesting thing that pretty much any people on the left should be very knowledgeable about.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's something that we could certainly explore in an episode in 2020.
That's right. But Aaron, I really appreciate you calling in. As always, you don't just give me the fuzzies. You, as demonstrated by the purpose of the shows, you contribute positively with your own points of view, and I appreciate that.
Thanks, guys. Have a great day.
Yeah, you too. But I think, Mary, did you want to jump on that?
I just had, I guess, kind of a little comment as we're talking about fear and fear keeping us within the status quo that we've sort of been in. Just thinking of, the national anthem, and the very last phrase is like the land of the free and the home of the brave, and I feel like we might need to change that last word.
Oh, to what, Mary? What are you suggesting?
Like home of the weenies or something.
the Weenie Hut Juniors. Super Weenie Hut Juniors. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, I think that there's a rhetoric that doesn't stand in that song, and it's kind of too bad.
Do you hate America, Mary? Do you not like America? Is that what I'm hearing from? Because I could easily say you're critiquing our national anthem.
Yeah, I am critiquing, but critique doesn't equal hatred, my friend.
Excellent. Just as the same as you can find the president's actions to be bad and not hate the president.
Dude, I wrote an entire thesis on the banality of evil, which. So yes, you can definitely critique things without hating.
Yeah.
That's what we do.
Yep. That's called using your brain. That's good. No, I think that's very valuable to bring up. Thank you for that. So maybe we can... Well,
we're singing Home of the Weenies now.
Yeah. I don't want to end with a quote from Milton Friedman for the year. I was going to tie it away with that, but we will not bring in moldy Milton Friedman for this piece.
You're welcome.
I do. Yeah, thank you, Matt. I do want to end on a positive note by saying thank you to WXIR and thank you as listeners, whoever you are and wherever you are, for tuning in and sharing your attention. We have a lot of work to do as a society and as a world, but none of it happens without using our critiquing brain, Mary, and none of it happens without us engaging in dialogue and speaking truth to power and really looking at issues in society that need fixing and being brave about it.
I was just gonna add that. Sometimes that means being brave.
Being brave and doing what we need to do to get things done. Even whether it's difficult or not, we have to do what we need to do to get things done, and that is to make a society where as few people suffer as possible. And that doesn't mean, that usually doesn't have anything to do with the economy or GDP. Well, the economy in terms of balancing a budget. When we're talking about balancing a budget, what actually should matter more than your ability as an elected representative to balance a so-called budget is to make sure that people are receiving education and healthcare and so on and so forth, because that is our purpose here on a planet and as a government and as a society, is to make sure as few people suffer as possible.
I would just like to, Jason, I know you can't do this, but especially on that note of receiving education, I would like to extend solidarity just to the local school district.
Mm-hmm. We will have to end it right here, though. Thank you for tuning in to Evidence of Design on 100.9 FM WXIR. Our past episodes are all cataloged on YouTube. If you search for Evidence of Design Episode X, 1 through 77, it'll pop up for you. We're also on Mixcloud. Thanks to Darian Lehman for uploading our episodes to the station's Mixcloud. So keep in touch with us. We won't see you until after the new year. Have a happy holidays, whatever it is you suffer. I know the holidays can be very challenging for many people, but stay in contact with those in your support network and those you care about.